Stanford University.
It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. James Gross, who is a professor of psychology here at Stanford. And he is best known for his research in emotion regulation, studying the different effects of how it is we choose to handle emotions in our lives, the effects on our physical health, our psychological well-being, our relationships. And he's also done some research looking at disorders including depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and autism. And he uses a lot of really great experimental methods that are quite fun to observe, such as bringing people into the laboratory and embarrassing them by making them sing, is it Barbra Streisand songs, and then having to listen to it back as people watch, making couples fight in the laboratory, and more recently studying what happens in the brain as people experience different emotions and try to handle those emotions in different ways. And he also was my research advisor when I was a graduate student here. And I don't think I've ever told you this, but one of the main reasons I came to Stanford was not for the glorious weather that we're experiencing today, but because when I came out to visit, I'd never met anyone who was so excited about psychology research. And so I think you're in for a real treat today. And James has been a great mentor in terms of teaching, and he's won Stanford's highest teaching honor, and for his work running the Psych 1 program here, a role he inherited from Phil Zimbardo and has done a lot of good with. So please join me in welcoming James Gross.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Whoa.
Too many mics.
Too many mics. Too many mics.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. You're going to turn yours off.
Mine are off now.
Good. Let's see if I buzz when I walk over to this part of the stage. No, that's terrific. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight. And it's wonderful to have a chance to talk about something I care about immensely, which is emotions and what we can do with our emotions. And to get started, just among friends, I wanted to ask, how many of you would say you have emotions? Anyone? Oh, you have emotions. That's good. Okay. So, what kind of emotions? Just short of shout out. What emotions do you guys have? What? Joy. Sadness. Shame. A little bit of shame up here. What else? Guilt sometimes. Fear at other times. Happiness. Okay. Good. Okay. So we're an emotional bunch. And that's not special to you, I'm sorry to report, but that's part of the human condition. We have emotions of lots of different kinds, some positive, some negative. And that brings me to the question, are there times in your lives, as you think about it, that emotions are helpful? Any times? Yes, some nods. For example, does anyone want to share an example of when an emotion's been helpful in your estimate? Anybody? Please, yeah.
A relationship with a lover.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're in a close relationship with a romantic partner. Having a strong emotion, let's say a positive emotion of love, can really, I think, glue people together in a powerful way. And an expression of that emotion really, I think, goes much further than just having the emotion but not letting it out. Another example, anyone else? Please, yes. Okay. It does, doesn't it? So a comment that sometimes when we're creating, whether it's an artistic sort of composition, musical composition, some other kind of creative work, maybe even writing, doing sculpture, that kind of excitement, that kind of energizing force really can kind of help us translate the ideas, the impressions that we have into reality. How about negative emotions? So far we've been focusing on positive emotions. Please, yes?
Fear and having to speak out in front of a group.
Okay, so does fear help? It helps?
Sometimes.
How would it help? It help?
Just to be aware of the emotion. It could be some deep breathing, it could be some relaxation.
Okay, but that sounds like you want to get rid of the fear. Is that true? Or does the fear helping actually with your performance? Because I think it can. Yeah, okay. And we might, what's interesting about this is that the helpful fear might not even be something we'd call fear. It's something we call being energized, being really sort of pumped up for whatever it is, a conversation, even a sports event. But in your example, talking to people, it's good to get energized. And a little bit of fear mixed in there, I think, makes you more alert, perhaps. Okay, so it's not just positive emotions, i.e. ones that feel good, that are sometimes functional. They even can be, quote, negative emotions, like fear, like feeling energized, that can be functional. Are emotions always good? Not in my life. No, I've got young kids, 10, 13, and 15, and interacting with my wonderful kids can be just great, but at other times it can be, no, pull out my hair, frustrating, as one of them pounds on the other and the other one comes squealing to us about the injustice in life and so forth. Okay, so we get a little bit frustrated, a little bit frazzled, and is someone telling me that it'll get better later, please? Eventually, thank you. Okay, good. I hope so. I'm counting on that. So my point then in starting out today is really simple. It's that we all have emotions. Sometimes we label emotions positive versus negative, but that label doesn't tell us whether the emotion that we're talking about is going to be functional or useful in a particular context. Some emotions, even ones that are labeled negative, can actually be very, very helpful. Some, quote, positive emotions can actually be destructive or harmful. Feeling very proud of our accomplishments in a way that belittles other people, for example. And at times, and this is a critical point that I'll keep coming back to, although emotions are often functional, sometimes they're not. And when they're not, we may want to do something about it. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is whether, when emotions are going in the wrong direction for us, given our goals, whether we can really do something about it. And if the answer is yes, as I'll argue it is, what exactly can we do? We detect in it is something that we can relate to, many of us, which is that we're doing one thing, trying to achieve a certain set of goals, and we have an emotion, and oops, that emotion is completely not what we had in mind, drags us in the wrong direction, like this poor guy who was like practically falling all over himself on stage, and we need to get back under control. Okay, like that poor guy struggled to do. And what I want to do today, as I say, is 5 things. 5 things. First, I want to talk with you about, before we get into emotion control, what exactly are emotions, so that we're all on the same page. We've given some examples, talked about a few vignettes from your everyday life, but let's get a little bit more specific about what are emotions. And then I want to talk about emotion regulation. And emotion regulation is the way that we refer broadly to this idea that we can sometimes modify or influence our emotions as they play themselves out. So first, what are emotions? Then we're going to talk about, well, what is emotion regulation? And then I want to really address this crucial question of, can emotions really be controlled? If yes, if so, are some ways of controlling our emotions better than others? To preview, I'm going to say yes to number 3. And I'm going to say it really matters under number 4, how we go about regulating our emotions. And then in the last chunk of the talk, depending on how much time we have, I'd like to talk about several different reasons I think we should care about anything I'm telling you tonight. Okay? And you can judge, of course, whether I've done a good job of convincing you that we should care about any of this. We're going to talk as we go through about why this stuff matters. But let's start out with, what are emotions, actually? What are they? I'm going to define emotions here for you as loosely coordinated changes in experiential, behavioral, and peripheral physiologic response systems. Hubbity-dubbity what? That's a mouthful. Okay, so here's the main point. Sometimes when we think of emotions, we're focused in on just one aspect, namely how we feel. I feel really bad, and that's my emotion. And for our purposes tonight, it's going to be important to understand that we think of emotions as being more than just the experience, what it feels like inside. That is important. It's crucial to what an emotion is. But emotions are more than that, because they're also behavioral changes, as, for example, shown in our face and posture, and then peripheral and even central physiologic changes. So we may have a feeling, yes, and an expressive display, yes, and physiologic changes, including blood pressure changes, our palms get sweaty, and various other responses. So that's what I'm meaning by emotions for tonight. Emotions, as I've said several times now, are sometimes terrific. They're great. We can celebrate them. They're helpful. How are they helpful? Well, they help us with what to pay attention to. We're bombarded every day, I don't need to tell you this, with way more stuff than we can pay attention to. And emotions can direct us to what's important in light of our current goals. Emotions also prepare responses. They prepare us physiologically and behaviorally to do often the right thing at the right time. Emotions also have cognitive consequences. Many of us have had many experiences with this. Something that's very emotional to us sticks better than something that's less emotional. So as William James long ago, more than a century ago, put it, emotions are really this sort of set of processes that kick in as we move through our lives to help us track what's really important to us. And think about it. After a week, at the end of a week, at the end of a day, at the end of a month, when you're interacting with someone you care about, do you simply go and sort of minute by minute through your day and say, this, I did this, and then I had breakfast, and I did that? And probably not. Probably what you scroll through your life thinking about is what are the emotions you had, because those emotions are marking what's actually important to you. So emotions are often helpful in many of these ways, but they're not always helpful or functional. And this means that people sometimes need to regulate or try to influence their emotions. Okay, so that's a point I've now made in several different ways. Examples. Road rage. Who hasn't seen this? Hopefully you haven't been the person raging away, but we've certainly seen this in other people. People climbing out of sunroofs they don't even have to get at somebody else to pound on them because, what, they cut into the other person's lane? That's anger that can be out of control that needs to be regulated. Most of us who work or interact with people who work know the overwhelm, the stress of having too many deadlines and too much stuff to do. And so that anxiety is a very important emotion to regulate. And then, of course, sadness. When we lose someone that we really care about a lot, sadness can be something we'd want to regulate or influence. So all of these are cases where we have strong emotions that we want to regulate or influence. So that's then a little bit about emotions, what they are, these multi-componential suites of responses that are often very helpful but sometimes not. And that then sets us up to ask, well, what is this thing called emotion regulation people talk about? And can we really, in fact, modify our emotions? What do I mean by emotion regulation? Emotion regulation refers broadly to processes that influence which emotions one has, when one has them, and how one experiences and expresses these emotions. Super broad. So we're talking about all manner of processes that somehow influence the emotion trajectory. Remembering that the emotion trajectory isn't just a feeling, it's also the behavior and the physiology. So it's which emotions one has, when one has them, and how one experiences and expresses these emotions. That's what I mean by emotion regulation. And it's defined, emotion regulation is defined by the activation of the goal to influence the emotion. So sometimes we can be pretty unsuccessful. And one of the questions we're going to be asking is, how often are we successful? And in what ways are we successful? But the definition is when you have the goal to try to not look so crabby, to look a little happier, to not be so sad, to not be so angry, to, whatever, feel a little bit more pumped up for something you're kind of dreading. All of these would be examples of having a goal to modify an emotion for some reason. So that now is what emotions are and a little bit about what I mean by emotion regulation. But let's get to this real question, which is, okay, fine, that's emotions. This is a little bit about what you're saying emotion regulation is. Can they be controlled? And I want to, because the series title is How to Think Like a Psychologist, I don't know about psychologists in general, but I'll tell you how I attacked some of these problems. And it's really going to be laid out in a way that I don't typically do in talks. And you guys can tell me if this is just, there's a really good reason I don't usually do this, because I shouldn't be as honest as this. But I'm going to be really honest with you guys. This is how I thought about this problem, sort of in chronological order. Okay, so I started with a real interest, and Kelly may at the end sort of ask me, James, why are you interested in emotions? And then I'll say something. But for now, because I want to cover some other things, I'm going to say, let's take for granted that I was interested in emotions. And as I thought about emotions, it seemed to me important that sometimes people express their emotions and sometimes they didn't. Just looking around the world. Sometimes people really, really worked hard to control their emotions, and other times people just let emotions fly. And I was really interested in that. And I was particularly interested because when I looked in the literature as I started to study psychology, it turned out there are two very different ideas about what should happen when someone tries hard. They have an emotion, but they try hard not to show it. Here's one idea. One idea is that The expression of emotion is so much part of what it means to have an emotion that if you bottle up the expression, the emotion sort of withers away. That's how important the expression is. You turn off the expression, and the emotion just sort of disappears. That's consistent with what's called the facial feedback hypothesis, which says that what plays out on your face either magnifies or diminishes the internal experience, depending on whether you magnify or diminish the expression. So that's one idea, and I'm not making this up. It's really in the literature. And there's this idea that this is what happens, for sure. You just sort of take the emotion off your face, and the whole thing disappears. So if you turn down the behavior, you're going to turn down the experience, you're going to turn down the physiology, because everything travels together. That's idea number one. Sounds reasonable. And then there's this other idea, which I also read about, and that's the idea that really underlies a lot of health psychology. That's the idea sort of the opposite. If you deny expression to your emotions on your face, it's going to bubble up in other channels. So far from everything going down together like the other idea, now the idea is you turn down your expressions. What happens to everything else? It goes up. Because you're denying, it's a hydraulic model, you're denying expression in this channel, and then it bubbles up. Bubble, 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 and your blood pressure goes up and everything. And so what was really cool for me, this is very early on, beginning graduate student, I was reading, I was poring over this, I was so interested, like what happens? I read in one literature, and one day I was like, oh yeah, everything's going to go down. Then I read this other literature, and like, ooh, physiology should go up. And I go back to this one, everything should go down. And I was like, whoa, this is crazy. There's like contradictory stuff going on here. I took this to my advisor, and he said, James, that's a great project. I was like, yay! You know, when your advisor says something even moderately good, you're like, dun, 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 Superman. So I felt really good about that. And so for my first year project, what I did was really straightforward. I just figured, look, only one of these can be right. You can't simultaneously suppress and have everything go down and have suppression increase stuff. Okay, that just can't happen simultaneously. So I'm going to test it. So this is going to be really straightforward. This will take me about 1 or 2 months. Because all I really need to do, this is the embarrassing part. I really thought this. It's like so embarrassing. And meanwhile, like millions of years later, I'm still kind of like plugging away at this stuff. But anyway, okay, we'll get there in a second. So I thought this was going to take a few months to sort of tidy up. And here's what I thought I needed to do. Okay, I heard that experiments were really good because, as you guys know very well, and I was learning at the time, there's big distinction between correlational studies where you sort of watch how two things co-vary. That's very nice, but then you can't really infer causality. So if two things sort of seem to be traveling together, maybe this one causes this one, or maybe this one causes this one, or maybe some third thing is pushing both of these suckers around. So if I just looked in everyday life at people who typically suppress and their typical emotional responses, even if I saw sort of what happens in a correlational sense, I wouldn't know what's causing what. I knew this, so I didn't want to do a correlational study. I wanted to do an experiment. Oh, yes. I wanted to do an experiment where I could fiddle with something. I could tell people, suppress or don't suppress. And so I knew I wanted to do that, so I was good on that, so that's an experiment. And I thought, okay, how do I do this? How do I do this? In the lab, I need to bring people into the lab, and I need to make them emotional. So I was like, I need to make people emotional. So I thought of all sorts of things I could do. Chop off it. No, I wasn't going to chop off their finger. I could shock them with electricity. Or I could use Confederates that told them really mean things about how ugly and stupid and smelly they were. It's like, I've got a great last name, Gross, for this. I could, like, you know, I could get away with almost anything. My advisor didn't think that was very good. So because it's not very controlled, and there's some ethical problems about telling people nasty things. And so here's what I did. I thought, okay, I am going to use film clips. I thought, that's kind of good. That's good because people pay to see films. And so there's sort of this ethical exemption around getting emotional when you see films, if you think about it. Like, you know, we see films and we get emotional, and that's fine. So I thought, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And this is what I thought would take me a couple months. I'm going to find a large sample of stimuli that elicit a number of specific emotions at slight, moderate, and intense levels. And I'm going to validate those using a multi-channel assessment procedure. And then having selected exactly the right stimuli, I'm going to run a study in which I randomly assign people to regulate their emotions. You guys can tell me that that is ridiculous to think you're going to do that in 2 months. It's ridiculous. It took me 5 years to do all the film stuff. But luckily, as I didn't have to get all those films organized. There are a lot of films out there. It's complicated, So it took me 5 years literally to do this whole film thing. But luckily, early on in the first year, I found some films that I thought were going to be great. So I separated the projects with the advice of my advisor. Very key advice. So I started with this idea, look, the literature's messed up. One thing says we should go one way, another thing says another way. I want to test this. I want to test this experimentally. To do this, I'm going to use films. So I brought people into the laboratory, and I randomly assigned them to either, please watch this film, and just respond as you naturally would. That was one condition. Then other people I randomly assigned to, please watch this film, and as you watch this film, try to act in such a way so that someone watching you wouldn't know you were feeling anything at all. Like this. And here's the question. The key question I had was whether when I told people to suppress, that's what I meant by suppress, just push down your face so no one knew you were feeling anything, would that decrease the emotion experience and physiology, like that first hypothesis? Or would it actually jack it up? I was going to settle this thing once and for all. I didn't quite, but anyway. So here's a study I did. Neutral warm-up film, just to have people kind of get comfortable with watching films. And then I showed people this disgusting surgical film, either under conditions to just watch or under conditions to, same film, but they got different instructions, to suppress in just the way that I described. So that was a study I did a long time ago as a graduate student. And what did I find? Okay, he didn't like that, did he? No, he really didn't. And this is somebody randomly assigned to the watch condition. He was just responding naturally, and afterwards he said, oh, James, that was disgusting. And you saw his face do all that twitchy stuff, and the physiology looked pretty excited too. Okay, now let's take somebody from the suppressed condition. So this is now someone watching exactly the same film, but now under the instructions to act in such a way that someone watching her wouldn't know she was feeling anything. Watch her carefully. Pretty good, huh? Wow. Yeah. And so the key question then in that first study, one of my very first studies, was which way would it go? Would suppression calm everything down so that all the indicators of emotion would go down? Or would it actually, a little bit like that hydraulic model, the face goes down, but other stuff goes up? What do you guys think? Who's on the first hypothesis? Who thinks everything should go down together? Raise your hand. Come on, don't be shy. Come on, raise your hand. Okay, only people in the front. No, okay, you in the back. That's perfect. Okay, now how many people are really more on the hydraulic side? Something's got to go up. Okay, that's more of you, but it's not totally decisive. So we need some science to lock this thing down. So let's see what we got. Now these panels they're like, I'm so excited about them. I couldn't take anything out because it was all beautiful to me because it was my first study. In English, what the heck are we talking about? This is a whole bunch of coders who looked at these tapes and coded disgust behavior, how much their face was twitching, whether they were touching their face, body movement, and blinks. And I want to just walk you through one of these panels to kind of turn this into English. Suppression is the dark lines, and no suppression is the white lines. And we're looking both during the film and then right after the film. And you can see looking in panel number 1, if you're in the front row probably, that if you compare the suppression folks, they show less disgust behavior than the no suppression. That's a little bit of a duh kind of finding, isn't it? Because I just told them not to show it, and they were able to do that. So that's, though, a little bit of an answer to the question, can people control emotions? Yeah, they can, in this simple sense of not showing it, and that kind of lasts on over to the post-film period as well. And you can see that same effect for facial movement. There's a little bit of a separation, particularly during the film. Again, so the suppression people showed less facial movement, less face touching. They actually showed diminished body movement compared to a baseline condition in the suppression group. And they showed, interestingly, increased blinks. Okay, so we'll come back to this. But basically what this says is, I told them what to do and they could do it. It doesn't answer our key question that we really want to know, which is, Did anything bubble up or not? Okay, so now let's talk about the experience. Whoa, what is this? Okay, this is a whole bunch of emotions I asked them about. The key emotion is disgust. Now here, very annoyingly, there's no difference. So it's like, wait, did it go down or up? Neither. Ooh, that's so irritating. Okay, but that's true. That's true. And if you look at these other emotions, that's the same basic story. A little bit of something going on with tension, but experientially, you can wipe it off your face, but it doesn't, for negative emotions, doesn't change how you feel. Yeah. But does it bubble up? Like, tell me about the physiology. Okay, here's the deal. Look at this, and you're going to feel so smart if you raise your hand second, because what this is telling you is that during this little period right here, so this is the instructional period, just you're waiting and sort of sitting there waiting for the film. You can see two different groups plotted out here. The suppressed group in the dark line, the dotted line is the watch group. These are now continuous plots, second by second, for this 2-minute period. And what does this tell us? We're going to use an index of sympathetic activation of your cardiovascular system, which is roughly blood pressure and heart rate and a little bit of skin temperature thrown in there. And I'm happy to go into unbelievable detail because I love this stuff, but probably for now I won't. Okay, so what is this telling us in English? This is telling us that people who suppressed, they look calm, they look cool, they feel kind of disgusted just like the other people, whoosh, greater physiologic response. The hydraulic model is right with respect to this outcome. Okay, so suppression, you can do it. Wipe emotions off your face. Does it make you feel good? No. It doesn't make you feel any better. And what does it do to the physiology? Does it make you nice and calm? Ah. Or does it make you like this? It makes you more like this. Okay, so the physiology is magnified. Even though you're sitting there very calm, your physiology is going chugga, 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 okay? And this is, I think, part of why there's now evidence that suppression, chronic suppression, can actually have adverse health consequences. I'd be delighted to come back to this at the end if you'd like me to. But for now, just to say, that's a first study in which I tried to tackle a problem. I was wildly optimistic about how long it would take me, but I was right about the kind of problem I tackled because I looked for something that would have interest value if it went one way or the other way. Does that mean rustling?
I can't figure out, that happens
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to keep talking because I got so much to do in the next half hour. It's ridiculous. And if we can get rid of the rustle, that'll be terrific. Okay, so that's suppression. That's telling us we can control our emotions, at least in the simple sense. And it tells us a little bit about the consequences of that one type of regulation. But what I was very interested in at that point was, are there better and worse ways of regulating emotions? And so what I did was try to think, okay, so how do people go about regulating emotions? Because I just studied one form of regulation, and it seemed to me that there are probably lots of ways of regulating emotions. And so I just asked people to reflect on times, and just like I did to you guys at the beginning of today's discussion, I asked people to talk about a time they tried to regulate their emotions. And so this person said, we had a paper that was given back in my class, and my roommate's in that class also. He got a very bad grade, and I, studly genius that I am, got a very good grade. So I kind of had to cover up my emotions. I was very happy inside, but at the same time, I didn't want that to show up to my roommate because he's my friend too. So I love this. I kind of put on my depressed face, and you know, my academic sad face. Okay, so this is like psychologically like really interesting, but for now, just notice that this is sort of like my suppression. Okay, so this is sort of like what I had already studied. And what I was doing in interviewing people was trying to figure out, well, what else do people do? And so what I found a lot of was things like this. This is an example where they say, yesterday I was lifeguarding and I fell into the pool wearing all my clothes. I could have gotten really mad, but I just decided to laugh it off. I suppose I altered my anger into amusement. I was trying to change my outlook on what happened. So basically, I thought about it and put it in perspective. And that really rung true, this idea that sometimes we just clamp down on the expression of our emotions, but at other times like this, we think differently about our situation. And that somehow has the effect of changing our emotions. And I got really interested in this, and I wanted to compare and contrast those two forms of regulation. And again, I'm really telling you what really happened in my little tiny career to this point. Okay, so that was like the second thing that happened. Number one, I did that one study. And number two, I was like, I wonder if like that's true of all emotions, all forms of regulation or not. And so I got interested in this. And so I operationalized this in a study where, and this will give you a sense, this is someone who was told to try to think about this same film in a way that as a scientist might, in terms of the technical aspects of the event she's observing. So look at her. She's carefully thinking about this differently. Okay. You can almost see her like thinking. It's like astonishing if you just look at her. Okay, so this is now how I operationalized reappraisal. And the key question was whether thinking differently has exactly the same consequences as suppression, because emotion regulation is emotion regulation, or whether it's actually pretty different. Because if you intercept the emotion early on by thinking differently, you just put it on a different track than if you are suppressing. That was the key question. And rather than just, because we're going to run out of time, going through every study I've ever done, what I thought I'd do is sort of like fast forward a little bit through like a gazillion studies that I've done and like lots of other people have now done, to summarize, so you get an overview, summarize all of the findings, or most of the findings, to sort of compare suppression, not just my little feeble first study, but lots of other studies, and then contrast that with the effects of reappraisal. So this is now, we're going to just summarize these findings. So suppression, I've already defined this, behaving in a way so someone watching you wouldn't know you were feeling anything. Okay, what are the findings, not just in my study, but across studies? Well, there's decreased behavior. We saw that in the study I presented. Doesn't actually turn out to make you feel better. We saw that in my first study as well. Interestingly, again, as I showed you, there's increased autonomic responses when you suppress either negative or positive emotions. And then I did like a lot of other control studies that I won't like get into real detail about. But if you just have someone, quote, suppress in a neutral emotion, doesn't do anything to the physiology. So it's not just hearing that someone's watching you or something general like that. It's actually working against an emotion that seems to be crucial. No change or increases actually in amygdala and insula. These are deep brain structures associated with emotion generation. This is now using functional magnetic resonance imaging. And then there's recruitment of bilateral prefrontal cortex, these control regions, later in the trial. So this is the neural profile in some more recent studies of the systems that seem to be engaged to have these effects. Suppression in subsequent studies, we found out, turns out to be cognitively costly. So if I tell you, when I'm showing you in my laboratory, if I show you a film, and then I say, please suppress, and then I later ask questions about the film, it's going to be kind of like you didn't see the film. That's how bad your memory is going to be. Because you're really busy thinking, oh, got to control that emotion, another emotion. Okay, so you get really distracted, and that's really cognitively costly. The other thing that we found that's kind of interesting is that suppression's socially costly. You guys probably already knew this, but I had to do the study to find out. If I'm suppressing, that's bad for your blood pressure. Weird. Okay, so if we're interacting, and I'm being like Mr. Suppression, my blood pressure goes digga, 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 and yours does too. Digga, digga, digga. Isn't it interesting? Secondhand smokish kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, okay, so that's kind of cool. These effects, and there's like tons more to say about like everything, but whatever. These social costs turns out to be pronounced among individuals with European American cultural values, but not among individuals with Asian cultural values. Interesting. So this is moderated by culture. So we got to be really careful here, because I'm talking about some generalizations, but then I'm hinting that there's some really cool cultural specificity. Wow. Okay, so maybe we can talk about that later too. So all this is just sort of saying again a little bit what I said about suppression. Now let's talk about reappraisal to try to see whether there really are differences in different forms of regulation. So what do I mean by reappraisal? Again, that's the modifying the meaning of a situation so as to change its emotional impact. I'm thinking differently. Okay, so reappraisal, what's the deal with that? Well, it actually also decreases emotion expressive behavior. As you saw with that third person I showed you, when she was busy thinking differently about this film, she looked less emotional. And we find that consistently at the group level as well. Here, big difference, first difference. Suppression doesn't make you feel good. Reappraisal, you start to actually feel better. If you're thinking differently, you start feeling differently as well. That's important. So that's the first difference with suppression. Suppression doesn't make you feel any better. In fact, in some studies, it makes you feel worse. Here, reappraisal is making you feel better. Here, again, another difference. Suppression was jacking up your physiology. Here, what do you have? Reappraisal decreases your autonomic and neuroendocrine responses. You don't only just feel better, your body calms down. Wow. Centrally, decreased activation in the amygdala and insula, these emotion-generative structures, via recruitment of these prefrontal control regions early in the trial. In English, at the level of the peripheral physiology and feeling, but also at the level of these core emotion-generative structures, reappraisal and suppression, different profiles. Reappraisal is coming in early, rerouting the emotion so that you actually feel better. Suppression, you look good, you don't feel good, and your body's going haywire. What about the cognitive consequences? This is really interesting, a little counterintuitive. Suppression sounds very behavioral, but you know what? It has these cognitive consequences that you and I were discussing a second ago. But reappraisal, which sounds so cognitive, actually doesn't have cognitive consequences as assessed by later impact. Why? How is that? How is that possible? That's because if you think about it differently, okay, boom, I'm a doctor watching this. I'm a medical student. Oh, what's a tool technique? Oh, yes, I use this scalpel this way. Okay, whatever. If you're thinking about it differently, then once you got that frame, you're good. You're good to go. And this actually works, and we'll talk about this later, in everyday life. Someone comes down the hall, doesn't smile at you, you're like, you have that feeling of like, I'm hated, I'm not loved, what's going on here? And then all of a sudden you're like, but you know what, I bet they're just having a bad day. You have that new idea, and now you're no longer crushed and devastated on a good day, right? You actually think about it differently, okay? So no discernible cognitive consequences. And what's cool, if I'm reappraising with you, you know how when I was suppressing with you, your blood pressure was going digga, digga, digga? If I'm reappraising, you like interacting with me. Hey, James is kind of a nice guy. You might think. Hypothetically. Yeah, okay, right. Okay, so that you didn't endorse that very quickly. I noticed that. That's good. We're just getting to know each other. All right, so what have we done then in this part of the talk? I've tried to argue that suppression does allow us to regulate our emotions, so we can control our emotions. And now I've tried to argue the different forms of regulation, like reappraisal versus suppression, actually have different consequences. Very cool. And what's really even more interesting from my perspective is that as we went through all these studies and studies and studies, I began to get a broader understanding of how to think about this whole space. And I'll sort of go through all the little dead alleys and all the other stuff that I sort of spent some time on and summarize in a sort of ridiculous way. I've never tried this way of summarizing things before, so you guys can tell Kelly politely later about how much you hated or liked this part of my discussion. So what did I do? Okay, we're going to take this Luminous Louis. I just made that part up just to entertain myself. But okay, so Luminous Louis is luminous because we can kind of see his brain, and that's and all those nice organs there. And he's just hanging out. He's hanging out in a dark alley, hypothetically. Okay, so he's hanging out in a dark alley, and all of a sudden he hears this noise, and he suddenly sees this ghost like rising up. And I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? Now, to put this a little bit technically, I mean, not very technically, but a little bit technically, what we might want to say is, okay, what's going on here is that he's in this weird situation in an alley, seeing a little ghostish thing going on, and he's then attending to that situation and appraising it, thinking about like, ooh, this is really bad. This ghost might like get bigger and like hurt me or something. And then he has this emotional response, which changes all sorts of response parameters. He feels a certain way, his behavior goes a different way, and his physiology may be going haywire. And those responses then go back and maybe help him get out of that situation, resolve never to go back in the alley or whatever happened. So he's kind of freaked out by this little ghostish thing. Now, here's the way to summarize, in an embarrassingly simple fashion, millions of years of work on this topic. Say, well, there are three kinds of things that Luminous Louis, that is such a great way to put this. Luminous Louis, you have to entertain yourself. Don't you feel that's important? If you're not entertained, no one else is going to be. And it's, you know, okay, so here we go. Luminous Louis. What can he do? What can Louis do to feel better in this situation? Three kinds of things. This is like the sort of boiled down version. Number one, he can do something to fiddle with his response. He's freaked out, and he can, for example, suppress or do something else to kind of fiddle, clamp down, modify the response itself. That's number one. That's category number one. We focused on suppression. There are other things you can do, but that's one category. Okay. Category number 2 is cognitive. So he can change his body. Category number 2 is he can change his mind, either his attention or his cognitive functioning, or his appraisal. And reappraisal was an example of this. But there are other things that we've studied and others have studied that go over here. But these kind of go together because this category of strategies for regulating his emotions really are how he attends to and makes sense of the world around him. That's category 2. Category 3 is that he can change some aspect of his world. He can move, he can resolve never to go back into alleys, he can get his derriere out of that alley or whatever. Okay, so these responses form a third category. So if I have an emotion that I want to change, there are 3 kinds of things I can do. I can, number 1, just fiddle with the emotion itself. For example, suppression. Option number 2, I can actually change something about how I'm attending to or making sense of the world. I can change my mind. That's category 2. Category 3 is I can change my situation. And those are 3 very simple sort of strategies or categories. And I've argued, with a little bit of evidence, that it really matters which of those categories we tap into to regulate our emotions. And I've drawn that contrast not by all 3 categories, but by just thinking about 2 of those categories. And we've done studies in all of them, and they're all wildly interesting. Okay, now at this point you might be thinking, I mean, hopefully not rudely, wait, who cares? Again, maybe you do care. If you care, that's terrific. If you don't care, this is for you, okay? So, who cares? Who cares about any of this? Like, why? I mean, I care because I've done it. And so cognitive dissonance says that I have to care because what have I done with my life? Okay, so I care, but why should you care? This is the key question. All right, so here we go. I'm going to talk about 3, if I can talk fast, 3 reasons we should care. Let's talk about temptation. Temptation can be defined as the desire to behave in a way that's expected to be regretted at a later time. I mean, that's what's weird. Like, sometimes in life we do things and we're not sure. We're like, maybe this is a good idea, maybe it's not. Maybe this vacation will work, maybe it won't. And you can kind of understand if it doesn't work. You're like, oh, well, how did I know? It didn't work. But then at other times, we do things that we know. At the time, it's not just like our kids or somebody else. It's like we do this. We do something that we know we're going to regret. That's what I want to focus on. Isn't that weird? We do that. Yeah, we do that. That's temptation. And examples, in case you need examples, because you don't have any in your life. Eating sugar-coated donuts when we really are trying not to eat sugar-coated donuts. Driving too fast when we prefer to stay alive and keep other people alive. Or watching junky TV shows even though we don't want to watch us. But we're sitting there. I don't want to watch it. Like, what are you doing? Okay, I don't know. And so the question here is, can reappraisal be used, this thinking form of regulation be used, to increase your willpower, so you can turn off the TV or do whatever else you need to, in situations such as these, by draining pleasure from the tempting activity? I don't know. So that if we could do that, that'd be kind of cool. We would care about that because we want to have better self-control and not have all this temptation stuff going on in our lives. So here's what we did. Aaron Megan, Aaron was a student of mine, and I, this looks highly technical. It's not. This is an overview of someone's head with a very big nose. I think Aaron was teasing me because I have a rather big nose. But I didn't ask him about the size of the nose in this figure. But anyway, that's me probably. And I'm watching, in this cartoon schematic, a little TV monitor that presents little math problems that I can do, you can do, everyone can do. Okay. And meanwhile, that's A. B is a little camera watching me. And the magic part is that on this TV screen, we're playing this really funny, whose line is it? Anyway, I love, that is so funny. Okay, so anyway, these folks, these participants, were told to do these math problems. And then while they were trying to do that, we played these really funny videos. And so you can see the temptation. They're trying to do well. They mean to do well. They want to do well. This is a very important math test. But then this thing right beside him is like blaring this really funny stuff. And our question was whether, in that context, anyone would be tempted. And if people were tempted, whether we could use reappraisal to decrease temptation. That's what we were trying to figure out. And you know, actually the idea for this, just because we're among friends, was a little bit born on, you know, when I took some trips to talk and stuff like that, and I kept wanting to do work. But then the screens kept playing these films, and I kept going, like the whole trip I was like getting eyeball fatigue, because I kept like trying to work on these reviews and look at grants, and I kept getting distracted. I was like, we need to put that in the lab, Aaron. And so we put that in the lab, and that's how we did it. And what are the key findings? Well, when we told some people, randomly assigned some people to reappraise, and some people just respond naturally, it turns out the people who reappraised peaked less than people who were just responding naturally. They were somehow less tempted. What do I mean by reappraisal? It's really simple. We just said, we broke the test in 2 parts, gave everyone that first part, and then for the second part, we told half of them, just keep going, you know, do your best. The other half we said, keep going, do your best. And sometimes it helps to think about this as a test of your willpower. They're like, really? Dun, dun, dun. And they're like, whew, okay, wow, that really made a difference. So that's what I meant by reappraisal. And reappraisers took less pleasure in peaking. So they peaked less, and it didn't feel as good. They watched it, but they didn't feel very good because they were admitting that they had very low willpower. Okay, and in follow-up studies, we've actually followed up this line of work. We've shown that a similar reappraisal manipulation leads to less off-topic internet surfing and better task performance. And in another study, less gazing around the room and better task performance. So you can use this in a variety of educational contexts. Okay, so that's one reason we should care. Temptation. It might help us with temptation. Reason number 2. Question, please. Good. That's a great question. So the question is, why isn't that suppression? From our perspective, the difference between reappraisal and suppression is that reappraisal involves thinking about your situation differently. And so now for me, and this is why we think it's reappraisal, it's no longer just a math test. It's a test of something I care about, my willpower. I'm now thinking of, it's the same thing, but I'm thinking about it differently. Kind of like in a job interview, if you can help someone see this as not a test of whether you have any worth as a human ever, but which, you know, then you'd be really nervous, but instead, hey, this is your chance to check them out, to see whether this company would be a good fit for you. Okay, so you're interviewing them. Same interview, but now I'm thinking about it. I'm interviewing you. You're not interviewing me. Ha! Okay, so that's just a frame, a mental set. And that's different from suppression, which would be more like try to clamp down on your expression in the sense that we meant it. Does that help? Okay, great question. So let me give you a second. I know I need to kind of a little bit talk fast, but in a second, reason we should care from my perspective, and this is not funny. I mean, sorry, I didn't put that very well. If anything was funny about the temptation, haha, this is really seriously not funny. I'm a clinical psychologist, and for me, this is actually a real passion and a real interest. And it's psychopathology. We know that more than half of all psychiatric disorders involve emotion dysregulation. The anxiety disorders, social anxiety, specific phobias, others, generalized anxiety disorders, certainly the mood disorders like depression, very, very important conditions. Everyone in this room is touched either directly or indirectly by these conditions. We know this because the prevalence, lifetime prevalence of these disorders is 50%. Okay? Hugely big problem for society. And we're all touched, either directly or indirectly, by these conditions. And our question was, now again on a much more serious note, can we use emotion regulation and an understanding of emotion regulation to get purchase on some of these fundamental disorders? One particularly common disorder, social anxiety disorder, that's where you feel extreme apprehension when performing in front of others or interacting with others. And this is a chronic psychiatric condition, as I said, characterized by fear and avoidance of social situations because you're so worried about others' evaluation. There are high levels of personal distress and functional impairment. And a while ago, people, even in the business, used to think, people are just a little bit shy. No. Serious generalized social anxiety disorder can be fundamentally disruptive to a life. It can lead to someone not being able to work productively or interact with others. I'm hearing rustling. But we're ignoring that. Okay. Or reappraising. Okay. Or something. All right. So here's the idea. In psychopathology in general, and we'll focus on social anxiety in particular, there's exaggerated anxiety responses in social contexts. Mr. Red Shirt over here is pretty stressed out in social interactions where everyone else is having fun. And the thought is, from a regulation perspective, there may be some difficulty that he's having regulating his emotions, and that may be leading to these heightened patterns of reactivity. And so what we've done, this is a study with a student, Tal Carthy. We've looked, this is a sample of children, we've looked at whether the intensity and frequency of negative emotions higher in children with anxiety than in non-anxious controls. And yes, there are clearly differential patterns of reactivity. And more interestingly, we've tried to figure out in a variety of ways whether there are these differences in regulation as well as differences in reactivity. And what this panel is telling us, anxious children in dark, is telling us that anxious children relative to non-anxious controls use more avoidance, seek help rather than directly problem solving, and are by contrast less likely to directly problem solve and less likely, and this is our friend, reappraisal. They're less able to reappraise, suggesting that these patterns of disrupted reactivity may be connected to dysfunctional emotion regulation. We followed this up in adults. Give you one quick example. This is a slice through the brain, an axial slice through the brain, as though we did zip like this and took off my head and pointed it down like this. And we're now looking at these red splotches, which tell us that there's greater activity in these regions when people are trying to regulate their emotions. And what we're particularly interested in is differential responses in 3 of these regions for people with social anxiety versus healthy controls. And what we can see from these plots is that people with social anxiety are less able, these are adults now, less able to recruit these control regions that are designed to downregulate anxious responses. And this is consistent with the behavioral data I just showed you with kids, suggesting that in social anxiety there may be a fundamental problem with certain aspects of regulation. And so in some of the studies we're doing now, we're actually not just observing the problem, but trying to fix it. So we're doing studies where we're bringing in people with social anxiety and then assigning them to different types of therapy and trying to look at the brain before and after these different types of interventions, trying to see whether we can improve the forms of regulation. Turns out, as I've said just a second ago, individuals with social anxiety disorder show greater reactivity and less effective emotion regulation than healthy folks. Differences in both behavior and brain. And we're finding in work that we're doing in my lab, cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on reappraisal and cognitive restructuring, leads to better emotion regulation, which in turn leads to lesser symptoms. So this is a second reason, in my view, we should care. Not just because it might help us with daily temptation, but when we come to the domain of psychopathology, even serious psychopathology, this approach, we think, might give clinicians better tools to help people in need. In the last few minutes, I want to turn to a third reason we should care. Okay? Third reason we should care. And that's intergroup conflict. This is now, we're going from sort of more micro daily things to very serious long-term clinical things to now really big picture. So if you don't care about any of this, I hope you'll care about this. In ending long-standing conflicts represents, in I think all of our view, an urgent global challenge. And the question is it possible to use an emotion regulation perspective to help? I don't know. Is that possible? Our perspective starts with the idea that long-standing hatred's sort of resting on the idea that the other group's evil and won't change. If I really hate another group, underneath that hate, we think, is the idea that that group is evil and they're never, ever going to change. And so what we were interested in is to shake this belief in the unchangeable nature of the outgroup by manipulating general beliefs, not about that group, but about whether groups in general could change. So that by changing that appraisal, that idea about other groups being evil and unchangeable, by suggesting that groups actually can change, we thought that might actually make someone more willing to support compromise for peace. And we did this in collaboration. This is with one of my colleagues here, Carol Dweck, and also a colleague who is a postdoc with me, Eran Halperin, in Israel. And what we did, this is a really quick summary. This is a paper that came out last week in Science. And what this shows us is that we randomly assign people to have one of two very simple sort of treatments, where they read a little article that either said that groups definitely can change, research has shown that groups in general can change, that's the malleable group, or groups actually can't change. That's the contrast. And what we found is that this little manipulation in Israelis led to positive attitudes towards Palestinians and a greater willingness to compromise for peace. Wow, that's really amazing to us. And we also did it the other way around, because we were interested in whether Palestinians would also be shifted by the same belief manipulation. And we found indeed that positive attitudes shifted towards Israeli Jews, and there's a greater willingness to compromise for peace. Do we think that's all there is to the conflict, this particular? Of course not. But in subsequent studies, we've looked in other world conflict zones and found similar relations. And this is, from my perspective, yet another reason to care about any of the stuff I've talked about, the basic work. Because although direct approaches to conflict sometimes work, they sometimes backfire. And we say our indirect approach leads to greater willingness to compromise. This approach, as I've shown you, works for both sides of this one conflict. And follow-up studies, as I again hinted, suggest this may generalize to other conflicts as well. So I've tried to give you then, just as quickly as I can go, 3 reasons why we might care about some of this work. 1, daily temptations, maybe that could be helped. 2, heavy-duty psychopathology. Also, reason for optimism that an emotion regulation perspective may be useful. Number 3, maybe even world conflict might be touched or addressed using this approach. So let's give you some take-home points, and then I'll stop. We'll take a little break. Number 1 take-home point from this talk, from my perspective, emotions can be controlled. I've answered that question for you. They can be controlled, and they can be controlled in different ways. How we go about controlling our emotions matters, because some strategies are more helpful in a particular situation than others. I want to be careful here. I don't want you to have the idea suppression's always, always, always bad, or reappraisal's always, 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 always good. Why don't I want you to think that? Well, suppression may be necessary. You're interacting with your boss. You'll be fired if you tell him or her what you think of him or her. So you just, calm on the exterior, because it's worth that extra cardiovascular responsivity to keep your job. It just is, okay? So suppression could be good. And you're not smart enough or quick enough to suddenly reappraise why your boss is being such an ogre to you, so you have to use suppression. What about reappraisal? Why isn't it always good? I'll take a serious example. Reappraisal can be used to justify someone's really, really abusive behavior in a relationship. And through that justification, what do? You stay in that relationship. And that can be really detrimental in the long term. So that's reappraisal being bad and suppression being good. So I want to have some caution here, because I've had to move fast. I've mostly emphasized suppression's bad, reappraisal's good, but we've got to keep in mind the context. Number 3, a lot of room for optimism. We can all learn to better regulate our emotions, and doing so may help us manage temptations, emotional challenges, and even societal conflict. With that, I'd like to acknowledge all the many beautiful and wonderful and smart people I get to work with here at the Stanford Psychophysiology Lab. This is how to get hold of me.
The first question, very serious question. I have to ask you about Luminous Louis.
Did that work or not work?
Well, I think it did work, but so here's the question.
Okay.
I've seen you give a talk like this maybe 1,000 times, and you always use a bear jumping out of the woods.
Do, yes.
And this is the first time the paranormal has ever appeared that I know of in your lectures. So I just wanted to know, is there something we should know about? Any experience in your life that is just like...
Okay, so Kelly is getting off on the wrong foot here, because she's hinting that in my Psychology 1 classes, Kelly and I work together in Psychology 1, and one of my favorite moments, and the students' least favorite but most memorable moments, is where I'm illustrating different emotion theories. And so I'm sort of being rather staid and formal, as best I can. And then all of a sudden, without, I won't do this now because you'll, I don't know, something bad will happen. But
spoiler alert.
Yeah, so I then all of a sudden leap out and pretend to be a bear, and everyone jumps a foot out of their chair. And I then use the emotion that I just generated in everybody, particularly the ones that were dozing off a little in the back. They're like, whoa! They did an earthquake or something. And so Kelly's wondering why I shifted from bears to ghosts.
If there's not an interesting answer,
I think there may not be something wildly interesting. I don't believe particularly in ghosts, but I thought it could be a little bit more, I don't know, zany than just a bear. Is it more zany?
It was zany.
A little zany. Okay,
Yeah,
so we'll work on this as a first showing. So nothing. I haven't had any special experiences with this.
So you kind of gave me a hint as a question I might ask, which is why are you interested in emotions? So since you gave me that softball,
I did. Softball.
Back to you.
So there are a couple levels to this. And we don't have time to go into my deepest recesses of my psyche, so we're going to stay at the surface level. Plus, then I won't burst into tears or something, which would be convenient. One of the things we talked, several of us just a moment ago, were talking about culture, and you might think, if you were an untrained observer, that the cultural differences between someone like my mother who grew up in England and someone like my father who grew up in America would be trivial to non-existent. You might just think that. I mean, it's English, and things are spelled differently occasionally, but apart from that, no differences. From the point of view of a kid, with parents from these different cultural contexts, one of the things that's really interesting is that because there's the assumption that it's the same language, they sort of thought there'd be no cultural difference. But I was very impressed by very substantial cultural differences, particularly around emotion. But it worked in sort of the opposite way from the way you'd think. So, stiff upper lip, British sort of style, was not my mom. So mom reacted against that. So literally played a record. Back, many of you will appreciate this when there were records. So playing a record, borrowed from the library. We didn't have a lot of money. And it was on the Sears little record player that I had, bright orange and white. And the arm would skip so badly on this record player that we had to actually glue a nickel on top. So did he do that too? Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, we're listening to this Chopin thingamabob, and my mom stood there just floods of tears. Bless her. So that's how I grew up. So far, you'd think stiff upper lip, but I was just fascinated because, and then my sister's just like this too. She what? I didn't really know what was happening. So my mom and my sister just massively emotional. And my dad, American, sort of, didn't express a lot of emotion. And so for me, it was just really interesting. I didn't know if this was a male-female thing, if this was normal, abnormal, but I was really impressed by the role of emotions and the attempts people make or don't make to regulate emotions. So just up close and personal in my family. That's level one. Mm-hmm. Level two, which becomes a little bit more interesting, and I'll go fast because we have other questions, is that my parents thought it was a great idea. You can ask me later whether I thought it was a great idea to have lots of foster kids and adopt lots of kids. And so there are many really good things about that and many somewhat challenging things about that proposition from a kid's point of view. And so I grew up not only with culturally different parents, but also a very, very interesting multi-ethnic, multi-everything family of origin. And so there I was, just trying to stay organized and emotionally and otherwise. And I had various crazy things going on, police called, drug deals going on within my family. It's just woo. Okay, so I was very interested in others' emotions, my emotions, and then trying to regulate my emotions to just sort of basically stay afloat. That's 2 levels down. We're going to stop there just so we all stay good with that. But that's, I think, some of the early origins of how I ended up with the kinds of questions I had by the time I got to graduate school. There's a more cerebral part of this, which I usually say is my only answer, but since we're friends, this is going on the internet. Oh well. Never mind, I'm so sorry. But anyway, among friends, the other part, the more cerebral part that I usually trot out first is also a little bit true or partially true the way these things are, is that in college I was a philosophy major, and I kept sort of getting interested, no matter what the context, in a single problem, which is how do reason and passions interact. And I kept getting interested. That's, of course, a major theme in Western thought. And I found again and again, and now I've told you the autobiographical context within which that makes lots of sense now. But so that's, I think, also true for me, that I intellectually am very interested in, well, when should we be rational and when should we be emotional, and how can we kind of organize this in a way that we take advantage of our emotions when we want to, but then we can kind of regulate them in these different ways I'm studying when we don't want those emotions. Enough?
Yeah, actually, I want to follow up on two things you said.
Sure.
So since you mentioned your parents,
I did.
I'm curious, I met your kids. Well, I didn't know they were teenagers, that's right. And maybe things are a little different now.
Isn't that frightening?
But when they were like 5 and 6, these were like the most sophisticated emotional regulators I'd ever met. Like bargaining about whether or not they got extra minutes with a toy.
Yeah.
Very impressive. And so I was wondering what you use from psychology, your own research or other theories, to shape how you parent.
Wow, okay, great question. So I've usually tried to not apply everything I know or think I know to kids. You know, you're sort of agreeing with me, right? Yeah. Yeah, because, you know, I'm really proud of the science we've done, my students and I really am grateful for my increased understanding, but I think that there's so many hundreds of decisions you have to make every day before breakfast about how to parent that it's, I think for me at least, dangerous to try to move away from my rich intuitive sense of what's right for my kids to, oh, last week in the lab I did this. Maybe that'll work. So I generally, yeah, and there's some historical precedents that would make us worry about, you know, depending too heavily, as John Watson, for example, did on his intuitions about and his science about what should be done with kids. And so I actually stay very close to my intuition. I also had the incredibly good luck to, this is going to be on the video, to get married to a wonderful, no, it's true, it's actually really true. I'm going to show her this part too. But I did, it's actually really true. Got married to the most wonderful person in the world, and she has really, really strong and good intuitions about how to raise kids. So all this now back to Kelly's very flattering and very nice comments about our kids. I think that comes maybe a little bit out of the things I've studied. But I think it's more that we know that emotions are important, and we try to give our kids ways of, I was talking with some folks during break about this, ways of thinking about emotions in a maybe more differentiated fashion than some of us were given by our parents or the people who brought us up. So what I try to do is not say, okay, always reappraise, never suppress, but it's more general than that. It's really trying to express how different people can have different emotions even in what appears the same situation, and that those different emotions can be valid, and they don't need to be expressed by clobbering your sister or brother, and they can be expressed in lots of ways, and that even when you want to, you can actually influence or regulate your emotions and others' emotions. And so that came across, and I'm no parenting expert at all. I only have 3 kids, and that's plenty, and you know, I'm doing my best. But with those kids, what we tried to do, and what Kelly's referring to in part, is that we would have them, and this is a little bit unusual maybe, we would have them from a very early age. If there's a disagreement and if there was a big fight, we would have them come and talk to us, and so the warring parties would come, and they just thought this was normal. And I think they still think this is normal. So they would come to us, and so, you know, Anne and Mark, who are now, you know, quite a bit older than they were at the time, they're now 10 and 13, but when they were tiny, so Anne was just learning to talk, she'd come and say, Mark stole my toy, and that's not fair, not fair. And so I'd say, okay, sweetie, so tell me more about your perspective. And so I'm holding her hand. Isn't that weird? Psychology. Anyway, so I'd hold her hand, and I'd be holding Mark's hand. I'd say, sweetie, so tell me. She says, it's not fair because it's my toy, and you gave it to me, and I really want to keep my toy. I say, sweetie, I really understand your perspective, so you really want to keep your toy. You don't want anyone else to play with it? Yes, that's exactly right. And so then I'd ask Mark, I'd say, so sweetie, what's your perspective? And he'd say, well, that's not fair. That's not fair because she left it on the floor, and she wasn't playing with it. I want to play with it. And it was sitting on the floor, and I want to play with it. And so if something's sitting on the floor, I want to play with it. So, okay, sweetie, I really understand that. So when you came into the playroom, then no one was using it. No one was using it. Okay, and so you thought it'd be really okay for you to play with it. Yeah, I wanted to play with it. Okay, and so then I would just literally, I'd say, okay, that's your perspective. I really understand that, Mark. And Anne, so from your perspective, this was your toy. But Mark is saying he found it, and you weren't playing with it. And so he thought that it would be okay to, okay, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but it's a little weird, but it's sort of deliberate. It's sort of really holding them in the same space and just helping reinforce the idea each of their emotions is valid. It comes from sort of their own appreciation, however old they are, of the situation. and that it doesn't have to be one is right or the other's right. And what we're going to do is to negotiate a settlement or a solution. Okay, and I know it's ridiculous. It's a toy, who cares? But what we thought, and the reason we invested so much energy in this that Kelly's referring to, is that we thought that if they could really get the idea that emotions are okay, different people have different emotions, different people have different perspectives, and we can kind of work it out. I wish most of my colleagues knew. No, I mean, I wish people in general do this. It's hard to learn this. Many people who are much older than my kids don't get this yet. And so I think, and in part, that's an indictment of our society. I think the way we handle emotions, the way we think about emotions in many societal contexts may not be optimal. And so what we're trying to do is build a little microcultural context that in some ways works against that. And we'll see, whether my kids still speak to me when they go to college or something, whether we've done something right. But that's, I think, how we think about it.
Something you just said is really interesting, this cultural indictment. I think in our culture, we really do believe that our emotions are valid readouts of the world, that there is an inherent truth. If we're feeling a certain way, it's justified. Yeah. If we're angry, it's because there's something in the world that we should be angry about. And that may be one of the real benefits of a strategy like cognitive reappraisal, where it forces us to get a little bit of space between this immediate identification with, if I have an emotion, it's right and it's true and I need to act on it.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely valid point. And some of you may know this, in cognitive behavioral therapy, that's one of the key moves that they make. And so people like Ellis and others who've been foundational thinkers in cognitive behavioral therapy really stress that, and I'll try to be brief here, that just as Kelly nicely said, many people walking around the world think that when something happens in the world, or an antecedent condition happens, that automatically leads to a consequence, an emotional consequence. Someone gets in my face and I'm angry, and that's just the way it is, and that's a real readout of sort of what's truly happening in the world. And what these guys like Ellis have argued is that between the A and the C, the antecedent and the consequence, is actually a hidden B. Okay, this is sort of a simple way of putting it, a belief. And that's what cognitive reappraisal really highlights. That between the he's getting in my face, that's the antecedent, and the consequent, the emotional response, hidden between those, we think those are just glued together, but hidden between those two is B. Between A and C is a B, and the B is a belief. And so we need to think about the A, B, C, where the B is a belief, because that, if we really get that idea, we get some space. And so we can then realize that someone else, like Mark and Ann, my kids, may have the same antecedent, different consequences, and the reason they're different is that they're different beliefs. The B's are different. And that then gives us some space and a way to operate to change others and even our own emotions. So I think that's a really fundamental insight, and one that we really try to leverage when we think about cognitive reappraisal in particular. Yeah.
So the other thing that you mentioned was how in the West we have this kind of complicated relationship between reason and emotion, and whether reason should trump emotion, or how important is it to use our emotions. And I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on something you mentioned at the beginning of the class, that sometimes emotions we don't necessarily want to feel can have a real function, and maybe say something about whether we could over-regulate in an attempt to kind of escape the emotions we don't want to feel. What's the function of them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, or sort of comment. Let me say a couple things about that. So this is back to the idea that sometimes we make a distinction between positive and negative emotions, and that sort of sounds like it's simple, like the negative ones are the ones that I don't want to feel and shouldn't have and are not functional. That would be all one category. And then the positive emotions are the ones I feel good and that I want to feel and I should feel because they're functional. It sounds like all of those things travel together. And what I suggested and what I really think is true is that actually it's more complicated than that, and that from an evolutionary perspective, and some of you I think gave me an example at the beginning of the talk when I was asking about emotions, about fear being useful in some context. For example, when giving a presentation, that it can kind of energize you. And I think that's a good example of something that sometimes feels bad but can be very functional. And I take an evolutionary perspective, which suggests that we, like all the other species, have been shaped over long periods of time, and that what we see today is very much the result of these pressures that our ancestors faced over millennia. And so that the minds that we have, including our emotions, are the result of this long play of forces that gradually shaped who survived and who didn't. And so that doesn't mean that all emotions are always, in all contexts, today, wonderful. Not at all. It just means that many emotions, even ones that feel pretty nasty, like disgust and fear and anger, can actually be understood by looking at adaptive value over many different contexts. And so disgust doesn't feel good, but it may lead us to expel stuff that would otherwise make us sick or even kill us, right? It's like, ugh, blocks us from further ingestion of a nasty, toxic substance. Fear can mobilize forces to get out of a bad situation. Anger, again, can feel really, really bad, but it can actually give us the backbone to interact with someone who's trampling all over our rights in a way that's actually for the good in the longer term. So these would all be cases of emotions that sometimes feel bad, but that actually be really adaptive. And I think, broadly speaking, in the Western tradition, we've maybe oversimplified, so that we've mixed together things that really should be separated. And from my perspective, there are actually times when we might want to increase or decrease, quote, negative or positive emotions. I've tried to give a few examples of some of those. And what I'm interested in doing is, rather than smushing everything together and saying, okay, emotions are good or bad, or positive emotions are good and negative emotions are bad, I'm trying to further differentiate by saying, hey, maybe different emotions have different functions, possibly even for different people. And that we then need to understand how flexibly people can regulate or influence the emotions they have if they feel those emotions are unhelpful to them in a given context. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of how I think about things.
So one last question for you before we switch over to the group. In 2008, the New York Times did an article with you asking you to comment on Barack Obama's emotion regulation style. If you recall, at the time, people were very impressed by how calm and cool he was, and you commented about that. And it's okay, quick question, quick version. Do you think that Obama right now is actually cool and calm, or is he bubbling up on the inside? If you had to guess.
So, I don't know the guy. I'd love to know the guy. Clearly a complicated individual. I think he is probably deeply cerebral, like really, and I think he sort of needs to be to manage the pressure he faces every day. When I think on a busy day, I've got to do all this, it sort of calms me down to think about all the things he has to do in the first 5 minutes of his day that make my whole lifetime.
That's a nice example of reappraisal right there.
To make my whole lifetime look rather inconsequential, actually. And so I think he's actually deeply cool. Another question that I think sort of hidden beside your question is, would I have any advice for him? I don't really. He wouldn't listen to me if I did offer him advice. But I think what's interesting is that, and there have been discussions of this, you can be too cool in this cultural context. And there can be, in fact, times when you really need to get pissed off and, and I think he's sometimes hurt, from my perspective, by not having that kind of fiery aspect that others evince sort of maybe even too much of. So I think there's, again, for me, this comes back to this very core theme, which is it's all about flexibility. It's all about developing the capacity to understand your emotions, understand the context and the demands of those contexts, and then matching in a very flexible fashion a rich array of regulatory strategies in real time to the situational contexts in which your emotions occur. Put that way, it sounds like, oh, that's easy. No, no, it's not. It's really not easy. I study this stuff, and of course I, like everybody in the room, have times when I'm really pretty upset about something, and I find it hard to, really in real time engage the reappraisal maneuvers that I know that I could and should. Okay, so we're all in the same boat, but I think what we're trying to do in my group is to create a space within which we can think a little differently and maybe in a little bit more differentiated fashion about how emotions work, when they're useful, and then what we can do to manage or control our emotions. And I hope it's clear by now that when I say control, can we control our emotions? Sometimes, and in many of the examples I gave, it's turning down emotions. But that's not all there is to emotion regulation. And that's why I use the term emotion regulation rather than emotion control. Because control always sounds like it's turning down. But for us, emotion regulation could easily be increasing a certain type of anger for strategic gain. So by emotion regulation, that broadens it, because I think you can turn up or down negative or positive emotions. If you do that flexibly, And if Barack Obama could do that flexibly, I think that would be a big plus. Okay, I don't know if that helps or not.
With that campaign advice for 2012, I'm going to let you call on folks as you see fit.
Does anyone have any questions? Please.
Wait.
We're going to electrocute ourselves if you do this. Yeah, and turn it off. Yes, please. Yes, I did. Yeah, I'd love to elaborate. So the question is, in the discussion of suppression, you okay over there? Okay, great. So the question is, in the discussion of suppression, as I was giving an overview of findings, I hinted that we actually have found that the negative social consequences of suppression, that's when I suppress, your blood pressure goes up, that part of things, that actually differs by cultural context. And I said, please ask me about that. And now you're nicely asking me about that. I wish we knew more about this, but what that finding means is that in certain cultural contexts, if I'm interacting with you and you don't give me any emotional back channel signals, I can't tell what's going on for you. And I feel really worried. I don't know if we're connecting or if things are going well. And I might get really stressed. And that, I think, is part of why my blood pressure goes up if someone's suppressing. But in other cultural contexts, particularly among people who don't know each other very well, it's much more appropriate, in fact, the norm, to be rather impassive, to be rather more careful with one's emotional displays. And in that cultural context, I might be really freaked out if you started getting all emotional on me, whereas I might feel really comfortable if you're just calm. And so that's, I think, one way of thinking in broad strokes about why we might find social consequences in one cultural context but not the other. Now, one of the tricks, and some of my colleagues and students now are very interested. So Emily Butler did some of this work with me as a graduate student and is now doing lovely work on her own. Some folks are really interested in pursuing this, and there are a couple different strategies. You can't, of course, randomly assign people to cultural backgrounds. Wouldn't that be nice if I could suddenly say, okay, all right, you're from this cultural context now. But there are things you can do that are correlational, so I can measure differences in people's cultural backgrounds and look whether that predicts which types of regulation they use and what consequences those forms of regulation might have. You can also go to different countries and actually do the same studies and see whether they replicate or whether things look quite different. And much of what I've told you about does replicate, so it's really quite general. But some of the social consequences of suppression look like they're culture specific. And so lots of people are really interested in that. So thank you for asking. Anything else you guys are curious about, please? Yes. Sorry, age? Yeah, I'd love to. We've studied, although I didn't have time to really get into this, people when they're pretty young, kids, all the way through people when they're much older, okay, into their 80s and 90s. And we've been very interested in how people change in their use of emotion regulation over the lifespan. I'll give you two quick findings, just to give you a sense of how we've approached this problem. One thing that we've been really interested in is when kids are able to do that reappraisal stuff I was talking about. When do they have the capacity to do that? Because these prefrontal regions that we know from our imaging studies that are crucial, really, as we know, mature quite late in people and when they're 20s, in their 20s. And so you might imagine that particularly adolescents, I'm living this right now with my, particularly adolescents have maybe some emotion regulatory challenges. And so and their parents do too, because they have to live with them. And so what we're interested in these studies is how early kids can really do reappraisal and whether that changes over adolescence in a way that might be predicted by the maturation of these prefrontal regions. And it turns out, and this sounds sort of obvious now that we've found it, is that young kids as early as 8, 9, and 10 can start to do reappraisal, gets better and better through adolescence, and in a way that's congruent with these underlying biological changes in the control regions. So that's part of the story about early on. Now, that doesn't mean just because kids can reappraise, they typically do. I think it takes a while for people to develop facility with reappraisal. Moving to the later in the lifespan, we've been really interested, and my colleague Laura Karstensen has done wonderful work showing that as people age,
there are many things that happen, of course, as we age. And as people get really old, some of the things sound kind of discouraging. There are changes in physical health. There are changes in terms of social support systems. Some of our friends have died when we get to be really old, and that's really, really hard. And when we look at that from outside that situation, Laura Carstensen has suggested that it sounds as though it'd be pretty negative. Some aspects of aging would be pretty negative, and so we might expect, looking from the outside, like negative emotions would go up and positive emotions would go way down. And what Laura Carstensen and her students have found is that, surprisingly, there's not that huge shift of increasing negative and decreasing positive emotions in later adulthood. In fact, negative emotions may even go down a little bit, and positive emotions sometimes, in some samples, at least are maintained and may even go up. Wow, that's super interesting. So we've done studies where we've tried to figure out, well, why is that? And there are lots of reasons. One of the things we found is that when you ask people about what they do to regulate their emotions, with a focus on suppression and reappraisal, older people tend to say they use suppression less and reappraisal more. And so I don't think this is all there is to the story, but part of what's happening, we think, is that as people age, yes, there are a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of wisdom too. And one very important type of wisdom, we think, is that they learn to use more successful or adaptive forms of regulation and to have less use of things they've sort of over time figured out don't help them as much. I don't think that's a full explanation, but those are some examples of how you might apply these perspectives to children and older age and folks who are older. Now, do I think that's a full analysis of either adolescence or later adulthood? Of course not. But do I think that might be part of the story? Yes, I think so. Other questions or comments or allergic reactions, please? Yes. Yeah.
Could you comment on what we've been talking about is emotions people are conscious of?
Yeah.
Could you comment on how it might change the landscape if people have emotions that they're not aware of, or perhaps they subconsciously suppress?
Yeah. That's a lovely question. Let me just say again to make sure you've all heard this. So I've focused on a tiny portion of this space where people are aware of their emotions and they then try on purpose to modify those emotions. And you're saying, James, wait a sec, there's a lot more in this space than you're focusing us on, because actually sometimes emotions play out outside of awareness. And what if we are trying to regulate those emotions? How does that work? How does that fit into the scheme? Hugely important question. And some of my students and I, Iris Mouse, when she was a graduate student with me, and colleagues like Amit Etkin over in psychiatry, are very interested in this problem of what's called implicit emotion regulation. And that's contrasted with the explicit, or sort of effortful, aware regulation that I focused on in my talk today. And I actually, like you, think that there's a huge and very important sort of set of processes that I did not address today that have to do with implicit regulatory processes. So the first idea, and I can't do everything that I'd like to in response to your question, but let me just throw out a couple key ideas. One, the idea that you've pointed us to, which is emotions, this multi-componential, experiential, behavioral, physiological sort of combination of things, can play out either when we're aware of it or outside our awareness. And for some people, they're surprised by that because they think, wait a sec, didn't you say that you have to experience the emotion? And if you remember, the definition was one that said these sorts of changes are typical, but you don't have to experience your emotion. And in fact, many of us can even think at times we've interacted with people who are insisting that they're not angry. They're really angry. We know they're angry. They're really angry. They're pounding the table. Their face is red. They're flushed. And they're insisting they're not angry. We think they're angry. Okay, now even if you take out the uninteresting cases where they're lying, we actually think that there are some very interesting cases where they're really not aware. And for those of us who don't get really angry out of our awareness, because we're always aware of our anger, think of a time when you're afraid. So when you're driving and all of a sudden your car loses control, and for many of us there's a moment where we're flailing around and doing all the right things, hopefully trying to stay on the road, and only later we dissolve into a panic. We only later realize that our bodies are going like this and we're really freaked out. That's because at the moment it would not have been very adaptive to sort of meditate on how afraid we were, because we would bang into a tree. So at that moment, we weren't attending to how freaked out we were attending to trying to stay on the road. So in either these little ways, momentary gap in an awareness of fear, or more extended context where we're just not aware that we're just really an irate kind of person, I think emotions can play out outside our awareness. And so then, if that's true, we then have a really complicated space all of a sudden, because we've got implicit emotions playing out outside of awareness, and those then can be regulated through implicit maneuvers. And so there's a whole implicit set of processes that can operate. Some of these parallel the strategies I've talked about, and some of them are different. We think that attention and cognitive change, two forms of regulation, the sort of mental operations, are the ones that are going to be really crucial in thinking about implicit regulation. And we think that much of our avoidance and some of the ways we habitually think about things may actually be motivated to try to decrease certain emotions that we'd like to avoid. So in English, I'm really just saying emotions can be implicit, and there are a whole bunch of regulatory processes that we actually are starting to find ways of studying by priming people to think in certain ways, by intervening therapeutically, by giving certain training regimens to people to increase their regulatory capacity. And we think the reason these are so powerful is not just because you have another tool, which is what I kept talking about, that you can reach for when you want to change something on purpose. We think part of this is you actually are tuning the implicit regulatory machinery as well. Okay, so I think both are going on simultaneously. And I've got a million papers and a million other interesting things to tell you, but that's it for now. Anything else? One last question. Oh dear. Okay, so someone in the back who survived millions. Yes, you get the last question. You, absolutely you. Yes. Yeah.
Channeling it and suppressing it.
Yeah.
How is it that some people can operate with an intensity that's in like this space and others are like this?
Yeah. Okay, so for me, I'd take, so the question then is, wait a sec, something about Obama and my analysis. I'm really sorry that wasn't more complete. But anyway, you were using that as a jumping off point to talk about how, just in your observation, certainly thinking of Obama, but maybe other people as well, some people seem to be really have their emotion window set like this so that their strong emotions don't look that much different from their weak emotions. They're not very emotional. Others are like, need a big window to capture the range. They're just emoting, kind of like my mom, emotes, emotes, emotes. Yeah, and so that's sort of what interested me in emotion perhaps in the first place. And I think there are probably at least two factors that are going to be important to understanding that variation. One factor is sort of the emotion generating forces. And so that's in part going to be temperamentally based, biologically based. In our genome, we differ in how emotionally reactive we are. And so some people just naturally, early on, you can detect differences, even in little babies, between babies that respond very, very strongly in certain emotional contexts and others that don't. And we think these temperamental differences in just how strong the emotion response is, are going to be fundamental, not just for kids, but even for adults. So that's a reactivity difference, how big a response you get per unit input. And we think what makes it complicated to sort out adults is that on top of that reactivity difference is a whole layer of implicit and explicit regulatory processes that we've learned, acquired, found out about over our lifetimes. There may be a temperamental basis to some of these as well, but much of these we think is learned. And so what we see when we look at a person is a joint function of their underlying reactivity machinery, much of which is inherited, but on top of that is all of the strategies they've learned to modify, regulate, influence their emotions. And so there are some people, now back to your question, who actually are not very reactive, and they've got great control structures. You look at them, you have to check their pulse because you don't know if they're alive, right? Other people, and you can think of all combinations of these things, other people have pretty low reactivity but they've got crummy regulatory machinery. So they look a little bit more reactive, and if you slam them with unexpected news, you can see that they're alive because you can see a blip. Other people still have pretty robust reactivity. So they respond, they get anxious, they get stressed, they get happy. But boy, oh boy, they've got super turbocharged regulatory machinery. So if you look carefully, you can see that they're actually emotional, but they've got these great forms of regulation that make their emotions really powerful forces in their lives. They can channel them and succeed immensely, but they don't look like off the charts because they've got great regulation that usually can kick in. The last category you can imagine is hyper-reactive people with pathetic regulatory machinery. Whee! Okay, and that's how you get the range from my perspective. Two factors that combine, this is a cartoon, but combine high-low, all combinations, from low reactivity, great control, check their pulse, all the way to huge reactivity, no control. You know they're in the room when they're in the room. And with that, I should probably stop. Thank you guys so much. This has been a lot of fun.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.